The morning light over Kingsbury Run did nothing to warm the air. It only revealed what the fog had hidden: 2 burlap sacks wedged between the timbers of a rail bridge. When detectives opened them, steam rose from what was left of human bodies, cut clean through the spine, heads missing. The stench of formalin hinted the killer had tried to keep them from rotting, almost as if he wanted them studied. By noon, police had dragged the river for more remains. Reporters crowded the embankment, whispering words that Cleveland would repeat for years: another torso. Each discovery followed the same pattern: careful dissection, limbs arranged, the precision of someone who understood anatomy. What frightened investigators most wasn't the brutality, but the silence around it. The victims were vagrants, forgotten before they were found. No one came forward to name them, no one to claim them. A city already staggering under the Great Depression now carried a new dread, that somewhere in its industrial sprawl, a butcher worked unseen. Police Chief Eliot Ness, no relation to Eliot, declared a curfew along the valley. It did little. Within weeks, another torso surfaced downstream, flesh stripped to the bone by acid. Every clue dissolved into the mud, every headline fed a public hunger for answers Cleveland could not provide. The case file began under the title Kingsbury Run Murders. No one yet imagined it would grow into one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes. By winter's first frost, the detectives had learned the killer's rhythm: 2 at a time, always displayed, always taunting. They only needed to catch him before the next thaw revealed what he'd left buried in the cold ground. By the winter of 1935, Cleveland was a city bruised by hunger and humiliation. The Great Depression had turned its once booming steel heart into a wasteland of layoffs and liquor lines. Men slept under bridges, women bartered in alleyways, and the Cuyahoga River ran black with industrial waste. The area known as Kingsbury Run, a shallow ravine slicing through the city's east side, had become a shanty town for the forgotten. Cardboard roofs, oil drum fires, and the stench of despair defined it. It was here that police found their first true pattern. The victims, though nameless, shared a geography of suffering. They were men who lived where the city refused to look: vagrants, drifters, workers displaced by factories gone silent. For detectives, this wasn't a killer who hunted the wealthy or the known. It was someone who moved through Cleveland's underclass like a ghost, choosing victims no one would miss. The newspapers tried to brand the killer quickly, the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run, but inside the precinct, investigators resisted the drama. They had nothing solid to hold. No witnesses. No blood trail. Only the precise butchery of someone who knew anatomy, cutting between joints with professional ease. Some thought it was a butcher from the meat-packing district. Others whispered it might be a surgeon fallen from grace. Each new body deepened the paranoia. Detectives stopped trusting coincidences. Morgue attendants kept extra ice ready. The case began consuming every man assigned to it, their daily rhythm reduced to identifying limbs. Yet the more they worked, the less the city believed they could stop it. Kingsbury Run wasn't just a crime scene now, it was an open wound across Cleveland's conscience. And while most citizens prayed for warmth, the police prayed for a winter cold enough to freeze the killings in place. The thaw of early 1936 brought with it another discovery: 2 torsos unearthed by a pair of boys playing near the railway embankment. The flesh was pale, preserved by the cold, the cuts impossibly clean. One victim was a woman, her limbs arranged with eerie care. The other, a man, missing not just his head but also the heart. Reporters rushed to the scene before the coroner could finish his notes, their flashbulbs turning tragedy into spectacle. By morning, the words "torso killer" were on every front page from Cleveland to Chicago. Crowds gathered at the edges of Kingsbury Run, peering into the mud as if the killer might still be standing there. Panic seeped into the city's breath. Street preachers shouted about divine punishment, bar owners spoke in whispers, and the homeless vanished deeper into the alleys, fearful of being next. When a dismembered arm was found along the Cuyahoga River 2 weeks later, the mayor could no longer ignore the pressure. He called in Eliot Ness, the celebrated prohibition agent who had brought down Al Capone and now served as Cleveland's newly appointed safety director. Ness was supposed to be incorruptible, a man whose name alone could steady public faith. He arrived at the crime scene in a long coat and fedora, carrying a small notebook instead of a gun. Witnesses remembered how he stood in the cold wind, looking down at the remains without speaking for several minutes. His aide said later that he asked only one question: "How many more before we find his face?" From that moment, the investigation changed tone. What had been seen as a string of freak killings became, in Ness's words, an anatomy of fear, a puzzle that demanded dissection not of flesh, but of the city itself. Eliot Ness approached Kingsbury Run as if it were a battlefield left behind by an invisible enemy. Within days, he established a small investigative unit, later dubbed the Torso Task Force, comprised of homicide detectives, medical examiners, and a quiet forensic photographer named James Hogan whose images would later define the case. Ness refused to let the press near the meetings. His first order, every new body, every bone fragment, was to be photographed, measured, and mapped against the others. A wall inside the Cleveland Police Headquarters became a grim mosaic, torsos pinned beside arms, legs, and half-erased mugshots of possible matches. Forensics was still in its infancy, but Ness demanded precision. He brought in a young pathologist from Western Reserve University who confirmed what they feared: the killer wasn't improvising. Each cut was deliberate, following the same anatomical lines used in surgical instruction. Whoever did this understood not only how to kill but how to separate identity from remains. Without heads, fingerprints, or dental charts, the victims could never speak. That was the horror: he erased their names before he took their lives. By midsummer, 6 bodies had been found. Police combed hospitals, slaughterhouses, and medical schools for missing tools or staff. Nothing. The killer left no weapon, no signature, just mastery. Ness began to suspect the murderer was not a deranged wanderer but someone educated, someone who moved among the city's professionals by day. Meanwhile, Cleveland's poor paid the price. Patrols raided hobo camps, interrogating anyone with blood on his hands from butcher work or odd jobs. Many were beaten, some jailed without charge. In the newspapers, the word justice began to blur with vengeance. Inside the precinct, Ness's men whispered that the killer was watching them, because each time they searched one area, another body appeared somewhere else, perfectly timed, as if he knew their schedule. Cleveland was being studied, and for the first time, the great Eliot Ness was beginning to look afraid. By the end of 1936, Cleveland was no longer just haunted, it was humiliated. Each new corpse seemed to mock the city's pride in its modern police force and its hero, Eliot Ness. Reporters who once called him the untouchable now printed headlines that bled sarcasm: untouchable or untraceable. The torso killer had claimed his 7th and 8th victims, this time near the heart of downtown, one discovered behind a factory loading dock, another in an empty lot where children played stickball. The brutality was no longer confined to the forgotten edges of the city. It had crept into daylight. Panic spread faster than Ness's reassurances. Men refused to walk home alone at night. Boarding houses demanded curfews. Butchers were questioned daily, their knives inspected by weary detectives who already knew it was futile. The killer was evolving. Each dismemberment grew cleaner, more confident, as though he were practicing. The medical examiner quietly admitted that he admired the precision even as it revolted him. "Whoever he is," he said, "he's learning from us." Ness found himself drowning in the politics of fear. The mayor demanded visible progress. The newspapers demanded a name. Citizens demanded vengeance. But the evidence was still just bones and guesses. Every lead ended in the same dead end: the victim was unclaimed, the weapon untraceable, the scene too clean. Even the river had begun to refuse answers. The water that once carried away evidence now carried only suspicion. In his office, Ness kept the photographs of all 8 torsos pinned to the wall. He would stand before them at night, tracing the lines of incision with his eyes, looking for something: an error, a message, a pattern, anything human. What he saw instead was order. Cold, clinical order. The killer was not rushing. He was studying. And in that realization, Ness found the most terrifying truth yet: the torso murderer wasn't just killing people. He was perfecting a method. Spring 1937 opened with rain that turned Kingsbury Run into a trench of mud and rot. Workers clearing debris from a storm drain found what they thought was a mannequin leg tangled in the reeds. By the time detectives arrived, they'd unearthed 2 torsos, both male, both expertly dissected, both missing heads and hands. The coroner estimated death within days. That meant the killer was active, recent, close. Newspapers ran front-page photos of detectives knee-deep in filth under the headline, "10 now dead, the butcher walks free." Public anger boiled into paranoia. Taxi drivers carried pistols under their seats. Butchers were refused service in cafes. In the shanty towns, people slept in pairs, knives under pillows. Inside police headquarters, Ness's team was coming apart. The detectives had run down every lead from slaughterhouses to medical schools. One pattern emerged: formaldehyde traces found on the flesh, the same compound used by morticians and medical students. For the first time, suspicion turned toward Cleveland's own institutions. Ness ordered quiet background checks on hospital staff, anatomy instructors, and morgue assistants. Among the names was a former medical intern who'd vanished months earlier after being dismissed for instability. His file described him as brilliant, solitary, fascinated by clean dissection. But the trail was old, his address empty, his license revoked, no recent trace. Still, the possibility that the city's killer might be someone once trusted to study the human body unsettled everyone involved. At the same time, Ness noticed the press receiving details never officially released: cuts, tools, even the chemicals found. Someone inside his department was talking. The butcher didn't need to spy. Cleveland's own desperation fed him. And as Ness stared across the map of murders spread over the city, a slow realization took root: the pattern of dump sites wasn't random. It curved inward, tracing a slow spiral toward the heart of downtown, toward the very precinct investigating him. The summer of 1937 pressed down on Cleveland like a fever. Heat magnified the stench of the river, of the slums, and of fear itself. The police received hundreds of letters a week: confessions, accusations, prophesies. Some were written in neat cursive by the devout, others scrawled in soot and whiskey. Every citizen seemed to have seen the butcher, heard him, or dreamed of him. In desperation, Ness imposed martial precision. He restricted access to the morgue, sealed the Kingsbury Run area from reporters, and ordered every file in the case locked inside a steel cabinet labeled Homicide 316. Still, panic bled through. Rumors spread that the killer had begun leaving pieces as messages. Then, one morning, a janitor found something behind the central police station: a small wooden crate wrapped in butcher paper. Inside were 2 hands, neatly severed, the fingernails scrubbed clean. On the underside of the box was written in faded pencil, "You missed these." 4 days, officers whispered that the butcher had stood on the same steps they walked every morning. Ness examined the handwriting. It was blocky, deliberate, genderless. No fingerprints, no traceable origin. But its message was unmistakable: the killer was no longer hiding in the slums. He was circling them. The newspapers learned of the box and published sketches of the hands. Public trust collapsed entirely. City Council questioned Ness's leadership in open session. "If he can't protect his own house," one councilman said, "what hope do we have for ours?" That night, Ness sat alone in his office, the city's map spread before him, the crate at his feet. The spiral pattern of bodies now seemed complete, ending almost exactly at police headquarters. It wasn't just proximity, it was design. Someone wanted him to see it. Someone wanted him to feel hunted. By August of 1937, the case files filled an entire room. Every torso, every bone, every strand of hair catalogued and cross-referenced. It was the clerk, not a detective, who first noticed it. An old city morgue ledger, its pages curling at the edges, recorded each body's intake number and initials. But in 3 separate entries, the same hand had written a faint notation in the corner: X, classified. Those 3 victims, discovered months apart, had all been temporarily stored in the same autopsy chamber, and all had traces of a rare embalming fluid not yet used by the city at that time. The clerk assumed it was a filing error. Ness didn't. He ordered the records traced and learned the chamber had been used exclusively for training medical students and forensic staff, people who worked beside police, not against them. The revelation was suffocating. It suggested the butcher had access not only to the morgue but to its bodies before the public ever knew they were missing. Perhaps even to tools supplied by the city itself. Ness quietly interviewed pathologists, janitors, anyone with night shift keys. Most were cooperative, nervous. One, a morgue attendant named Frank Dolajol, grew defensive, trembling as he spoke. He admitted to handling several victims but denied any involvement. His alibi was thin, his background troubling, immigrant laborer, minor record, violent temper. But he was sloppy, erratic, nothing like the calculated mind they sought. Ness dismissed him as a symptom, not a source. Still, the evidence painted a grim picture. The killer didn't sneak into Cleveland's institutions. He belonged in them. That night, Ness walked through the morgue after hours. The tile floor echoed like a tunnel, the air thick with disinfectant. He stopped at the autopsy chamber marked X. The table was stainless steel, immaculate. He ran his hand over it, cold and smooth, and realized what terrified him most wasn't what had happened there. It was how clean it all felt. Clean, practiced, permitted. Somewhere between medicine and murder, someone had blurred the line. Autumn came early that year, with cold winds off Lake Erie carrying the scent of decay through Cleveland's alleys. On September 3, 1937, a fisherman stumbled upon something the city hadn't seen before, not a corpse, but a man still alive. He was crawling out of a drainage ditch near Kingsbury Run, bleeding from deep incisions across his shoulders and back. Half conscious, he was taken to the charity hospital, where detectives crowded around his bed. The man's name was Edward Andrassy, a known drifter and petty criminal, long thought dead. His voice was weak, slurred by morphine. He talked calm, Andrassy whispered. Said I was helping him learn. When asked who he was, Andrassy described a tall man, gloved, wearing a white coat that smelled of alcohol. He wasn't angry, he said. He sounded proud. Within hours, Andrassy died of shock, his final words barely audible. He cut while I watched. For the first time, the butcher had made a mistake. A living witness, even for minutes, was proof of proximity. But the lead only deepened the mystery. Doctors confirmed Andrassy's wounds matched the butcher's technique. Surgical, blood drained efficiently, no sign of frenzy. It was as though the killer had been interrupted mid-lesson. Ness ordered a full sweep of every hospital and clinic in Cleveland, demanding logs, supply lists, and shift rosters. He found nothing. What he did find, late one night, was a letter addressed to Director Ness slid under his office door. No return address, typed on hospital stationery. You are dissecting the wrong corpse, it read. The living ones tell more. The letter was signed only with the letter M. Ness stared at it for a long time before locking it away. He didn't tell the press. He didn't tell his men. But he started carrying the letter in his pocket everywhere he went, as a reminder or a warning. For the first time, Eliot Ness began to fear the investigation wasn't about catching a murderer. It was about being chosen by one. Sleep abandoned Eliot Ness. He spent his nights pacing the narrow corridors of City Hall, the glow of desk lamps stretching his shadow across walls lined with evidence photographs. The faces of his men had grown hollow from fatigue. The case had become their diet, their prayer, their curse. Each new report returned the same verdict. No leads, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no hope. Outside, Cleveland turned inward. People locked their windows even in the heat. Priests delivered sermons about repentance and unseen evil. Ness began to wonder whether the killer had become less a man and more a mirror, reflecting back everything the city refused to face. The letter signed M haunted him. Its paper had absorbed his fingerprints now, as if binding them together. The living ones tell more. Was it mockery or instruction? He read it each night, the words curling into his dreams. When a local reporter asked for a statement, Ness said only, "We're still listening to the dead." He had stopped confiding in anyone. His office smelled of stale coffee and old photographs. Each torso pinned to the caseboard seemed to move closer in the dim light. The spiral on the map, now complete, looked almost intentional, a design centered not on Kingsbury Run but on the public safety building itself. At this point in the investigation, the tension had become unbearable, not just for Ness but for the city and those who dared follow the case. If this revelation chills you the way it once did Cleveland's own detectives, remember to subscribe to Glen. Every untold file we open pulls us deeper into the shadows of America's past. When dawn broke, Ness stood by the window watching the mist rise from the river. For the first time, he imagined the killer doing the same. Two men awake in the same city, staring through the same fog, waiting to see who would blink first. The killings did not stop, they changed. In early 1938, a pair of headless corpses surfaced not in Kingsbury Run but on the far edge of Cleveland's industrial district, where the river met the rail yards. It was as if the butcher had redrawn his hunting map, expanding outward now that Ness's men guarded the ravine. The bodies were cleaner than before, the cuts more symmetrical, as though the killer were refining his technique. Even the disposal seemed deliberate, laid side by side beneath a rusted freight bridge, limbs crossed over the chest like saints in repose. The medical examiner noted something chilling. Both victims had been drained completely of blood. "It's surgery now," he whispered. "Not murder, surgery." For Ness, the change felt personal. The killer was adapting to every adjustment he made, always a step ahead. Patrol routes shifted, so did the murders. Public patrols increased. The killer vanished, only to return where the press least expected. Ness began to believe he was no longer dealing with chance, but with someone studying his methods in real time. A mimicry. A conversation. Then came the taunt, a single, neatly wrapped package left at the entrance of the Cleveland Press. Inside lay a jar containing a human heart suspended in formaldehyde. Attached was a typewritten note, "Still looking." The newsroom erupted in panic. Reporters rushed to phones. The story hit national wires within hours. Cleveland was no longer merely terrified, it was entertained. Ness, standing over the jar in the police lab, said nothing. But when one detective muttered that the heart looked almost perfectly dissected, Ness slammed his hand on the table. "He's not just killing," he said quietly. "He's teaching us how." That night, as the city retreated behind locked doors, the fog thickened over Kingsbury Run once more, as though the killer had been waiting for Cleveland to stop breathing, so he could start again. By midsummer 1938, the city was suffocating under its own fear. Cleveland's police force was exhausted, its citizens sleepless, and its press baying for blood. Ness had tried reason, science, and order, none had stopped the killings. So he turned to desperation. On a night heavy with thunderclouds, he assembled a convoy of patrol cars and fire engines at the edge of Kingsbury Run. Inside the vehicles sat armed officers, reporters kept deliberately uninformed, and a handful of city workers carrying gasoline cans. The order was simple and shocking: clear the shanty town. Every shack, every tent, every structure where the homeless slept. Clear it, and burn it. At midnight, flames began to rise. The fire rolled through the valley like a red tide, devouring cardboard walls and makeshift roofs. The vagrants fled screaming into the streets as smoke blackened the sky. Reporters who arrived later described it as an exorcism, Cleveland purging itself of ghosts. Ness stood on the ridge, coat flapping in the wind, his face unreadable in the flicker of orange light. When one officer asked if he thought the butcher was among them, Ness said only, "If he was, his ashes now." But the fire solved nothing. The next morning, 2 more bodies were found on the opposite side of the river, untouched by smoke, cut with the same precision. It was a message, proof that the killer had watched the flames from somewhere close, perhaps even smiling. The newspapers turned savage. "Ness burns the innocent, killer still free," one headline read. Public opinion fractured overnight. For the first time, citizens who once saw Ness as their savior began calling for his resignation. Yet in the smoldering ruins of Kingsbury Run, Ness believed he had glimpsed something deeper than failure. The butcher had thrived in the city's forgotten corners, feeding on neglect. By erasing those corners, Ness had forced the killer into the open. But now the question was, what would the butcher do when he realized the city itself was staring back? The fire that was meant to cleanse Cleveland instead poisoned it. For weeks afterward, the smell of burnt wood and scorched tin lingered over the valley, a reminder of how far the city had fallen. The displaced shantytown residents crowded into church basements and police holding cells, their soot-blackened faces turned toward the man who had ordered their exile. Eliot Ness, once untouchable, was now the villain of his own crusade. The newspapers labeled him the man who burned the poor. Letters arrived daily at City Hall, some pleading for compassion, others dripping with hatred. Among them, one stood apart, typed in the same style as the earlier letter signed M. It contained only 6 words: "Fire purifies nothing, Director." I watched. That night, Ness's telephone rang after midnight. When he answered, the line hissed with static, and a low voice spoke slowly, each word spaced with care. "You're learning," it said. "But not fast enough." The call ended before a trace could be placed. A second call came 2 nights later, from a payphone near the river. The same voice, calm, unhurried, male. "They burned for your sin," it said. "Not mine." Ness slammed the receiver down, his hands shaking for the first time since Chicago. Inside headquarters, morale disintegrated. Detectives began transferring out, exhausted by failure and haunted by the smell of smoke. Evidence disappeared, small things, like log sheets or chemical vials. Someone was either sloppy or helping the killer. When another parcel arrived, this time a box of surgical gloves stained dark brown, the chief clerk refused to open it. Ness took it himself. Inside was a single slip of paper reading, "You keep burning. I keep cutting." The city had stopped whispering. Now it screamed. Ministers denounced Ness from pulpits, citizens demanded his removal, and the mayor distanced himself completely. Yet through the noise, one truth gnawed at Ness: the killer was alive, watching, and closer than ever. For the first time, he realized he might not live to see the case end. By late 1938, Eliot Ness was unraveling. His office had become a bunker, curtains drawn, maps laid 3 deep, a revolver kept within reach. The mayor's secretary delivered the warning personally: either produce a name or hand in your badge. But Ness had stopped hearing politics. All he heard were echoes of that voice on the phone, calm and instructive, as if guiding him somewhere. Then came the next discovery: a pair of torsos washed ashore on the banks of Lake Erie, their flesh pale as porcelain, the joints cleanly separated. This time, however, one detail broke the pattern: small rectangular adhesive marks on each wrist and ankle, as if the victims had once worn hospital identification bands. At dawn, Ness stood on the beach while gulls screamed overhead, staring down at the bodies laid on white sheets. The wind whipped through the police tape. "Hospital bands," he murmured, "or morgue tags." Either way, it pointed inward again, to the very institutions sworn to preserve life. He ordered an immediate audit of all hospital and morgue supplies, focusing on tag rolls and adhesive stock. Hours later, a clerk from the county morgue confirmed something chilling. Several boxes of tags had gone missing months earlier. No paperwork, no replacement order, only a single signature in the ledger, dated the week before the first killings. The name on that line was Frank Dolezal, the same morgue attendant Ness had questioned a year earlier and dismissed. Dolezal had since moved to a boarding house near the river, paid in cash, quiet, solitary. It seemed impossible that this nervous immigrant could orchestrate so many precise murders, yet his name sat like a ghost in every corner of the case. Ness authorized surveillance, but part of him resisted the simplicity. Dolezal fit too neatly, too conveniently, like a story written for the public's relief. Still, the order stood: bring him in. When officers knocked on Dolezal's door 2 days later, no one answered. The lock was forced. The small room smelled faintly of antiseptic. On the desk sat an anatomy manual open to a chapter titled Methods of Clean Section. And beneath it, pinned to the wood with a scalpel, was a torn hospital tag. The printed name had been carefully removed, only one word remained, typed faintly in red: Director. The arrest came like thunder. "Torso killer caught," screamed the Cleveland press. The headlines rolled across the nation before dawn. Frank Dolezal, the Hungarian immigrant and former morgue attendant, was dragged from his boarding house in handcuffs, blinking under the flashbulbs of the same reporters who'd once haunted Kingsbury Run. The city exhaled for the first time in 3 years. Mothers let their children walk home from school again. Church bells rang. For the mayor, it was political salvation. For Eliot Ness, it was the sound of something breaking. Under interrogation, Dolezal trembled through his answers. His accent thickened with fear, his hands shook uncontrollably. He admitted to knowing some of the victims. They had passed through the morgue where he worked, but denied the killings. He insisted the missing tags were logged incorrectly, that others had access to the storeroom. Detectives shouted, slammed fists on the table, cornered him in a cell for 12 hours straight. Eventually, a confession appeared, typed, unsigned, and suspiciously eloquent for a man who struggled with English. "I dissected them to learn," it read, "and the city let me." When Ness read it, he felt nothing. Too neat. Too final. He visited Dolezal in his cell the next evening. The man's eyes were red, his clothes torn. "I didn't do it," he whispered. "You know that, don't you?" Ness didn't answer. He turned to leave, and Dolezal said something that stopped him cold. "He told me you'd come." 2 days later, Dolezal was found hanging in his cell, an apparent suicide. The guards claimed he used his belt. The coroner called it self-inflicted. But the bruising on his neck ran horizontal, not upward, and the belt itself was missing from evidence. Officially, the case was closed. Cleveland celebrated. Yet in the corridors of City Hall, Eliot Ness stood at his window, listening to the bells echo across the city, and whispered to himself, "We didn't catch him. We buried him." 3 weeks after Frank Dolezal's death, the river gave back another body. A man's torso, headless, armless, and bearing the same surgical precision that had haunted Cleveland for 3 long years, floated into a tangle of reeds near the very spot where the first victims had been found. The newspapers that had declared victory printed retractions in silence. The mayor refused comment. The public felt betrayed. The killer they'd celebrated catching was now proven innocent by the dead themselves. Eliot Ness stood on the riverbank in the grey morning light, the water lapping at his boots, and said nothing. For him, this was the final humiliation, the city's redemption turning instantly to ruin. But beneath his exhaustion was something darker, confirmation. He had been right to distrust the confession. Someone else had written it, someone who still walked free. Back in headquarters, Ness reviewed every page of the case. Dozens of signatures, reports, and morgue entries crossed his desk, but one pattern cut through the noise. The same handwriting appeared not only on the false confession but also in the morgue logs and a series of internal memos to his office. He followed the trail to a man who had worked quietly behind the scenes since the beginning. Dr. Francis Sweeney, a former army surgeon assigned to psychiatric wards, dismissed years earlier for unfit conduct. Sweeney was the cousin of a powerful congressman, which had kept his name buried under layers of protection. Ness arranged a discreet meeting under the guise of a psychiatric evaluation. The doctor arrived calm, smiling faintly, his hands clasped as if waiting for confession. He admitted knowing many of the victims, patients, indigents, men sent to him for treatment. When Ness asked if he killed them, Sweeney leaned forward and whispered, "I fixed what was broken." He spoke of the purity of separation, of teaching anatomy to a city without a spine. Ness sat motionless, aware that every word sounded like truth disguised as poetry. The interview ended without arrest. There was no physical evidence, only horror that felt too deliberate to prosecute. When Sweeney left the room, Ness realized the man hadn't denied a thing. He had explained it. That night, the phone rang again. The same voice from months before, smooth, unhurried. "You looked in the mirror today," it said. "Did you see me?" Then the line went dead. The morning after the meeting, Eliot Ness sent 2 plainclothes detectives to trail Dr. Francis Sweeney. Within hours, they were ordered to stand down. The call came directly from the mayor's office, citing medical privacy and political complications. Sweeney's cousin, Congressman Martin Sweeney, had made it clear, if the police harassed the doctor again, there would be consequences in Washington. The file on Sweeney was quietly sealed and stamped classified. Ness stared at the red ink until the letters blurred. For the first time, he understood that the killer wasn't untouchable because of cunning. He was untouchable because of protection. Over the next weeks, Ness became a ghost in his own department. His men avoided his eyes. The mayor stopped returning his calls. Every attempt to reopen the case was blocked by paperwork that appeared overnight. Sweeney continued his work at the VA hospital, where he conducted psychological evaluations on veterans shattered by war, men who often vanished into the system and were never seen again. Ness tried to visit once but was turned away at the door. "Doctor's orders," the nurse said. He began drinking, first to sleep, then to wake. His notes grew erratic, his handwriting frantic. "He's inside the city," one page read. "He uses its organs like tools." The photographs of the torsos now filled not only the office wall but his dreams. Every face he passed on the street looked like one that had disappeared. His reflection in the glass seemed to smirk back at him. One night, Ness sat alone in his office and received a package without a return address. Inside was a bottle of antiseptic and a scalpel wrapped in white linen. Beneath it, a note in that same blocky type: "We both keep things clean." Ness placed the scalpel in his desk drawer, closed it carefully, and whispered, "Then I'll make you dirty." But he never got the chance. The next morning, the Cleveland Police Department officially disbanded the Torso Task Force, citing budgetary constraints. The files were boxed and locked away. The killer, whoever he was, remained free. They met one final time in a white room that smelled of iodine and rain. It was the spring of 1939, and Ness, now thinner, paler, a man unraveling under silence, had arranged the meeting under a false pretense. Sweeney had been admitted to the U.S. Veterans Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, his family citing exhaustion. He sat in a wheelchair when Ness entered, his hospital gown crisp, his hair perfectly combed. The orderlies left them alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sweeney smiled, eyes bright with amusement. "Director," he said softly, "you look unwell. Still chasing ghosts?" Ness dropped a folder on the table between them. Inside were photographs, torsos, riverbanks, burned shacks, morgue entries, all the fragments of 3 years of failure. "I want to hear you deny it," Ness said. Sweeney leafed through the photos slowly, almost tenderly, pausing over one. "You see, the trick was never the cutting," he murmured. "It was the choosing. Who deserves to stay whole in a city that tears itself apart?" Ness slammed a fist on the table. "You butchered them." Sweeney looked up, his expression calm. "No," he said, "I revealed them. You burned the poor. I just finished the work." The words hit like a confession, but they had no weight in law. No tape recorder, no witnesses, only the echo of Sweeney's voice in the sterile room. Ness leaned close, whispering, "One day you'll slip, and I'll be there." Sweeney chuckled softly. "You already were," he said. "You lit the fire." Ness froze. Sweeney's eyes gleamed, delighted by the realization twisting across his face. "You see," he continued, "we're the same species, you and I. You cleanse with flame. I cleanse with steel. Both of us chasing purity in filth." When the guards returned, Sweeney was still smiling, and Ness could barely stand. He left the hospital shaking, the Ohio wind cold against his skin. The case file under his arm felt heavier than it ever had before. In that moment, Eliot Ness understood what had truly been dissected all along. Not the bodies, but the city and himself. The official report of that meeting never existed. There was no transcript, no signature, not even a record that Eliot Ness had entered the hospital that day. Within weeks, whispers spread through City Hall that the safety director was unwell. His once polished suits hung loose, his speeches rambling, his eyes bloodshot. The mayor quietly reassigned key duties to his deputies. In public, Ness smiled and spoke of civic reform. In private, he wandered the empty halls of the police headquarters at night, rereading the case notes until the words blurred. On his desk, the letter from M lay pinned under a paperweight, its edges yellowed, its meaning deeper now. Dr. Francis Sweeney, meanwhile, slipped neatly into the institution's routines. The Veterans Hospital listed him as consulting physician. The men he examined, broken soldiers and drifters, vanished quietly into the wards. When reporters asked about him, officials quoted confidentiality laws. Ness tried once more to file a warrant. It disappeared from the courthouse overnight. He began to see connections everywhere, the same chemicals ordered under different names, the same ink on unrelated reports, a web of bureaucracy woven like sutures closing a wound. At home, his wife found him sitting in darkness, murmuring that the city had learned to bleed without dying. He no longer trusted the phone, convinced that Sweeney, or someone, was still listening. When a package arrived containing a small mirror and a single typed line, "Now you watch yourself," he smashed it and burned the fragments in his fireplace. By 1940, Cleveland had stopped talking about the Torso murders. The newspapers called them unsolved mysteries and moved on to war headlines. But Ness knew the story hadn't ended. It had simply changed hosts. He believed the city itself had absorbed the killer's precision, the calm indifference of the cut. Every building that rose over Kingsbury Run seemed to him a monument to something unburied. He began keeping a final journal, its first line written in shaky ink: "The butcher was never caught because the city learned to do his work for him." By the summer of 1940, Eliot Ness was finished. The mayor's office accepted his resignation for personal reasons. Though everyone knew the truth, the public had grown tired of fear, and someone had to carry the weight of it. His name, once synonymous with order, now drifted through headlines as a warning of what obsession could do to a man. Reporters followed him for weeks, hoping for a confession, a breakdown, anything worth printing. But Ness gave them nothing. He packed his files into a single trunk, locked it, and left Cleveland without ceremony. The Torso case, as the archives came to call it, was officially closed. What couldn't be explained was quietly forgotten. Boxes of evidence were misplaced or destroyed. Others were sealed indefinitely under municipal code. The city built over Kingsbury Run, laying tracks and warehouses on top of the earth that had once yielded its dead. For the next generation, Cleveland would remember the murders only as a rumor, a dark fairy tale whispered to warn children away from the riverbanks. As for Dr. Francis Sweeney, he resigned from the Veterans Hospital later that same year. The reason cited: chronic nervous exhaustion. He checked himself into a private asylum in Dayton, where he remained for decades under the name John Doe No. 37. Visitors were forbidden. Doctors described him as lucid, articulate, and prone to discussing anatomy with unsettling affection. When the press tried to reach him, the inquiry vanished under layers of federal discretion. In 1952, long after Ness had faded into quiet obscurity, Sweeney sent him a postcard. It showed the Cleveland skyline, bright and new, steel towers rising where the slums once stood. The message on the back read, "Beautiful reconstruction. You finally finished what we started." There was no signature. Ness burned the card but kept the ashes in a small tin on his desk. He never spoke of it, not even to his wife. Yet from that day forward, he refused to walk near water. Something about reflections unsettled him. He said once, quietly, to an old friend, "If you stare long enough into the river, you'll see who it was all along." Time softened the horror but never erased it. The city that had once lived in dread of the butcher grew sleek and modern, its factories humming again, its skyline steel-bright and proud. Yet beneath that new order, the story of Kingsbury Run survived like a nerve that refused to die. Old patrolmen told it to rookies on night shifts. Drunks at the harbor swore they still saw things floating after storms. No one wanted to believe that a man could have cut through so many lives and never been found, but disbelief is fragile when the river runs deep. In 1960, long after Ness's death, a new police archivist began cataloguing the forgotten evidence room in the basement of City Hall. There, among rotting boxes and dust-choked files, he found a trunk marked "Director, Confidential." Inside were hundreds of photographs, fragments of correspondence, and a small leather-bound notebook labeled in neat handwriting, "The Run." Its pages were filled with notes, sketches of body positions, and increasingly erratic reflections that oscillated between confession and plea. One passage read, "He wasn't one man. He was what we became to survive him." Another, "If this ever comes out, let the record show I tried to bury the truth, but it kept digging itself up." The archivist turned the material over to his superiors, but the files never reached the public. They were absorbed into a new archive at the County Museum, labeled Unverified Personal Effects. The notebook's existence was mentioned once in a 1971 criminology lecture and then vanished again into rumor. Still, whispers persisted, students claiming to have seen sketches too detailed to be imagination, autopsy photos stamped with dates years apart but showing identical technique. Cleveland learned to turn its gaze forward, but Kingsbury Run stayed buried beneath its rail lines and warehouses, its soil mixed with the ashes of the shantytown Ness burned. And on certain fog-heavy mornings, when the wind carried the smell of rust and rain, the workers who unloaded freight near the old bridge swore they could hear the faint clatter of glass jars rolling in the current. By the late 1970s, America's fascination with its own darkness had returned. The rise of true crime journalism brought old cases back to light, and among them, none drew more obsession than the Cleveland torso murders. Television specials, pulp books, and radio hosts re-examined the photographs Ness had tried to bury. But it wasn't until 1981 that a graduate researcher from Case Western Reserve University, Dr. Miriam Carter, made a discovery that reignited the old horror. While studying archived autopsy reports, she noticed a peculiar surgical detail: the separation of the thoracic vertebrae at precisely the same interval in each victim. The cut was rare, nearly academic, a textbook demonstration of how to remove the upper spine cleanly without damaging the ribs. Carter compared these techniques to unrelated post-war medical cases across the Midwest, cadavers used for teaching, hospital autopsies, even embalming demonstrations from Kansas and Illinois. The same pattern appeared again and again, an anatomical signature echoed decades after the killings had stopped. Some of the doctors involved had studied in Cleveland during the 1940s under instructors who had once worked with Dr. Francis Sweeney. The implication was chilling. Sweeney hadn't just killed, he had taught. His precision had survived him, passed quietly through medical tradition like a contagion of method. When Carter published her findings, the medical community dismissed them as coincidence. Standard procedure evolves similarly everywhere, one journal wrote. But privately, several older pathologists admitted they had heard stories of a brilliant but unstable surgeon whose lessons blurred the line between study and sacrifice. One retired instructor confessed to Carter that he had once visited Sweeney's asylum in the 1950s. "He lectured me," the man said, trembling. "He explained the cuts in detail. He said they were meant to preserve the soul's architecture." Carter's article was quietly retracted months later. No reason was given. Her notes vanished from the university archives, and her grant was withdrawn. But in interviews years later, she claimed that before everything disappeared, she received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, showing a man in a hospital gown, smiling faintly for the camera. Scrawled across the back in uneven typewriter ink were 4 words: "Lesson never really ends." In the spring of 1983, Dr. Miriam Carter vanished. She had told colleagues she was driving to Cincinnati to lecture on forensic ethics, but she never arrived. Her car was found a week later at a rest stop along Interstate 71, doors locked, keys still in the ignition, the passenger seat dusted with surgical gloves and scattered lecture notes. Police suspected abduction, but there were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, just the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the upholstery. 2 weeks after her disappearance, highway workers dredging a drainage culvert 5 miles south discovered what they first thought was an animal carcass. The coroner's report, leaked years later, told a different story: human remains, disarticulated with professional accuracy. The spine removed at the thoracic junction, ribs intact, head and hands missing. DNA testing did not yet exist, but among the personal items found nearby was a wedding band engraved MC, 1977. The official statement called the body unidentified, yet everyone at Case Western knew whose initials those were. The FBI briefly reopened the torso murder file, suspecting a copycat. Analysts noted how the cuts mirrored those of the original Kingsbury Run victims nearly 50 years earlier. But there was no suspect, no motive, no ransom. What little evidence remained went missing during a warehouse transfer in 1986. When journalists pressed for answers, a police spokesman offered a line that sounded eerily familiar: "There are things we cannot explain, and perhaps were never meant to." Rumors spread that Carter had received more than just one photograph before she disappeared, that she had uncovered an entire collection of images, possibly teaching slides, showing procedures indistinguishable from the butcher's work, dated decades after his institutionalization. A few believed she'd stumbled onto a network of medical professionals preserving Sweeney's techniques as ritual. Others whispered something stranger, that the butcher had not been one man but a lineage, knowledge passed like scripture through scalpels and autopsy tables. After Carter's death, Case Western quietly discontinued its advanced anatomical dissection program. The department's archive was sealed for ethical review. But those who'd worked alongside her said she had been terrified in the weeks before she vanished. One friend recalled her final words over the phone: "It's not over. It never was. The city just changed shape." By the early 1990s, Cleveland's skyline had changed again. Glass towers where factories once stood, parking lots over the ghosts of Kingsbury Run. But the past has a way of resurfacing when concrete cracks. In 1992, a group of urban explorers entered the abandoned county morgue annex slated for demolition. They expected dust, graffiti, maybe a stray rat. What they found instead stopped them cold: a sealed sub-basement no one knew existed, its entrance hidden behind a false utility wall. The air was stale, thick with the smell of antiseptic and rust. Inside, under the dim glow of their flashlights, were 4 steel tables arranged in a square, each with drains leading to a central trough. The walls were lined with cabinets containing hundreds of small glass jars, their labels faded but legible: specimen, muscle tissue, spinal section. A metal cabinet bore an engraved plate: property of Public Safety Division, 1938. One explorer filmed everything on a camcorder, his shaky footage later surfacing briefly on local news before disappearing from archives. The tape showed something stranger still: a leather folder embossed with initials, and inside were documents written in a neat, formal hand: autopsy sketches, lists of dismemberments, and a typed sheet bearing the heading "Experimental Study, Continuity of Tissue Postmortem." The author's name was left blank. When authorities arrived, the chamber was sealed again, this time by order of the city's Historical Commission. Officials dismissed it as an unused workspace from early forensic training. But those who'd seen the footage swore the jars contained human parts, not animal. A retired detective recognized the table design as identical to those used during Ness's tenure, a custom order made for the Torso Task Force. Yet the date stamped on the folder's paper stock was 1951, 11 years after the case had closed, 5 years after Ness's resignation. The city issued a brief statement denying the authenticity of the footage. The explorers vanished from public record. 2 moved away, 1 refused interviews, and the cameraman reportedly died in an industrial accident months later. The tape was never found. But a still frame survived, circulated quietly among collectors, the final shot before the camera dropped. It shows a tiled wall, cracked and discolored, where someone had scrawled in what looked like rust: "Lesson never really ends." By 2005, true crime had become entertainment: streaming documentaries, podcasts, glossy books that turned tragedy into bingeable spectacle. Amid that noise, a Cleveland journalist named Lena Morrill decided to tell the Torso story as it really was. She wasn't interested in ghosts or copycats. She wanted to trace what had actually happened to the evidence, to the people, and to the truth Eliot Ness never found. Her research began conventionally enough: newspaper archives, municipal records, freedom of information requests. Every door led to another locked cabinet. Files marked public turned out to be misplaced, and digital records contained only placeholders, metadata without content. The deeper she searched, the more the city itself seemed to resist her. Then she found the name Miriam Carter buried in an old university faculty directory, her disappearance still listed as unresolved. Morrill tracked down Carter's surviving mentor, an elderly pathologist living in Florida. His voice shook over the phone. "You shouldn't be digging," he said. "The dead here have friends." Before hanging up, he added one final thing: the butcher wasn't a person. It was a department. Weeks later, a padded envelope arrived at Morrell's office. No return address. Inside was a flash drive containing scanned pages of what appeared to be Ness's missing notebook, the Run. The handwriting matched verified samples. The final page bore the same closing line: "Lesson never really ends." But beneath it, a new line had been added in a different ink, a different era: "It's your turn." Morrell's editor assumed it was a hoax until she showed him the metadata. The file creation date predated the model of the scanner used. The flash drive was impossible. Yet the material on it was real. Detailed autopsy sketches that modern forensic software confirmed matched both the 1930s victims and the 1983 Carter remains. The same hand. The same measurements. The same cold geometry. 3 days after she submitted her findings to a national magazine, Morrell disappeared. Her apartment showed no forced entry. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the screen frozen on a single sentence from her draft: "Cleveland was never cured, it simply sterilized the wound." In 2022, nearly 90 years after the first body surfaced in Kingsbury Run, the Cleveland Division of Police quietly reopened its cold case unit's oldest file. No press conference, no ceremony, just a line in a public record request marked re-examination of archival evidence. What triggered the action remains sealed, but insiders whispered about a new forensic software capable of matching incision patterns the way fingerprints match ridges. When analysts fed the torso photographs into the system, it returned a partial correlation not to a known killer, but to modern autopsy techniques used in Cleveland's medical examiner's office, methods taught as historical best practice. The realization struck the investigators with quiet dread. The precision that had once defined the butcher had become institutionalized. What had begun as pathology had evolved into protocol. The very procedures meant to document his crimes now imitated them. One detective, speaking off record, said, "It's like he wrote the manual." The more they searched, the stranger it became. A storage facility outside the city, long forgotten, held unclaimed evidence boxes from multiple decades, jars of preserved tissue labeled educational specimens. Among them was one marked simply EN, containing a single piece of vertebra wrapped in gauze. The DNA was degraded but human, gender indeterminate. When the team logged it, the barcode autofilled a date field, 1938. Within weeks, the re-examination halted. Official explanation: budget limitations. The officers were reassigned, the files relocked. But rumors spread that someone higher up had visited the evidence room late one night, an elderly woman with credentials tied to the local medical board. Security footage from that night was erased, except for one fragment. It showed the corridor lights flickering, then a white coat moving past the camera, stopping long enough for a pale hand to rest on the lens. The reopened file was closed again, sealed under new classification: archive restricted, continues instructional use. Cleveland moved on as it always had, its history sterilized, its horror catalogued as education. Yet those who've studied the case know the truth: the butcher was never caught because Cleveland never wanted him gone. It needed him, first as a monster, then as a method, finally as a memory. By the time the century turned, the Cleveland torso murders had become more than a case, they were a ritual of remembrance. The city could not escape them, so it adopted them. True crime walking tours traced the killer's path along repaved streets, local breweries named beers after the butcher, tourists bought shirts that read Headless since '35. What had once terrified a generation now sold souvenirs. Yet beneath the irony, a quiet unease lingered. Every anniversary brought new documentaries, new theories, each pretending to chase closure but really chasing the same question: why did Cleveland never want the truth? Historians called it civic amnesia, how a city buries guilt beneath progress. Psychologists called it transference, the need to transform fear into fascination. But for those who had handled the old files, it felt like something deeper. The pattern of denial, the bureaucratic cover-ups, the obsession with cleanliness, it was all the same anatomy, repeating itself. The killer might have been one man, or many, or simply the reflection of a city that learned precision from pain. Modern criminologists compared the case to a mirror held over time. In it they saw Eliot Ness, burning a valley to chase purity. They saw Sweeney, cutting flesh to expose corruption. And behind them both, they saw Cleveland, its factories bleeding smoke into the same sky, its people still looking for someone else to blame. The butcher, they argued, had become a symbol of something America never reconciled, that progress and cruelty often share the same hands. Every few years, someone new claims to have found the final clue, a DNA match, a hidden diary, a missing photograph, but nothing ever resolves. The story renews itself like scar tissue. Each generation opens the wound, studies it, names it, and leaves it unhealed. The legend endures because it offers what truth never could, a shape for guilt. In the end, the city no longer fears the butcher. It is him, methodical, detached, forever dissecting its own past to prove it still feels anything at all. Every telling of the butcher's story feels like reopening a grave. The names change, Ness, Sweeney, Carter, Morrill, but the rhythm does not. Each begins with curiosity, with the noble intent to understand. Each ends staring into the same hollowed silence. It's as if the case itself were alive, feeding on attention, sharpening its scalpel each time someone dares to trace its lines. Archivists, writers, criminologists, all of them become part of the investigation's anatomy, one more layer of tissue over the same cold truth. In the archives of the County Museum, an audio recording sits mislabeled among oral histories. It is dated 1964, voice unidentified. The speaker recounts the discovery of the first bodies, the terror, the city's descent. Halfway through, the voice falters. "He wanted to teach us order," it says softly. "He found chaos obedient." Then silence, 12 seconds of static, before the voice resumes, lower, different, "We are what he left behind." No one has been able to identify who made the recording, yet it has circulated quietly among researchers for decades. Those who listen closely claim they can hear something faint beneath the words, the steady drip of water, the faint hum of fluorescent light, and a whisper barely audible when the tape slows. Lesson never really ends. Each generation insists it will be the last to chase the butcher. Yet here we are again, dissecting what remains, finding patterns in the scars. The city's new skyline glints with glass like polished bone, and the river beneath it still moves as it did in 1935, slow, metallic, indifferent. Cleveland keeps telling the story not because it wants justice, but because it cannot stand the quiet. And so the telling itself becomes the final cut, reopening the wound just to prove the heart still beats. There's a moment, late in every investigation, when the map folds in on itself, when every lead, every date, every name begins to point not outward, but back toward the hands that drew it. That is where Cleveland has lived for nearly a century, tracing and retracing its own outline until the lines became scars. The police called it unfinished business. Historians call it America's first anatomy of fear. But anyone who stands beside the river at dawn knows the truth. It was never about the man who cut bodies apart. It was about the city that learned to live comfortably beside the pieces. Every document, every photograph, every voice on crackling tape carries the same fingerprint, the need to control what cannot be explained. Ness tried to burn it away. Sweeney tried to perfect it. The doctors studied it, the journalists sold it, and the viewers keep it alive with every click and replay. The butcher no longer belongs to history, he belongs to us, to the audience who cannot look away from precision turned holy. If you've watched this far, you've joined the investigation. You've walked the same fog, studied the same photographs, waited for the same revelation that never comes. Perhaps that is what the butcher wanted, to be remembered not as a man, but as a method endlessly repeated each time someone speaks his name. And if, after the screen fades, you still feel him close, the breath at your shoulder, the itch behind your ribs, it isn't superstition. It's memory. The kind that seeps into every retelling until truth and witness become the same thing. That's how the city keeps him alive, not through crime scenes, but through story. Every recounting, every headline, every whisper is another incision, one that never closes. The files are sealed again now, boxes stacked in municipal basements, names crossed out, evidence tagged and fading. The official story ends here, with no culprit, no closure, only a city that learned to live with an open wound. Kingsbury Run is paved over, the trains still rumble past, and no one walking those tracks can hear the heartbeat under the ground. But it's there, steady, patient, remembering. The river hasn't changed its course, only its reflection. It still carries what the city could not bury. History will tell you the case is unsolved. That's not true. It was solved the day Cleveland stopped looking. The butcher didn't vanish. He was inherited, his precision, his detachment, his cleanliness woven into the institutions that outlived him. The city kept dissecting itself, calling it progress.
Eliot Ness died alone in 1957. His name eroded to a cautionary tale. Sweeney died in a hospital bed 20 years later, still smiling. Their story should have ended there, but stories like this don't end. They wait, quietly, until someone decides to tell them again.
If you felt that stillness, that hum beneath the words, you've already heard what Cleveland hears when the wind drags through Kingsbury Run. It isn't ghosts. It's memory sharpening itself on the bones of history. And if you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.